So now we're going to talk about my database and my back end. So for the database, I used MongoDB, a serverless instance of MongoDB for my database. My user schema is a unique ID, a balance, which is an integer, an email, which is a string, a name, which is a string, and a password, which is a string. As you can see in my all data, it does save every user, their email address, and then it returns their account balance. And in my Mongo database, it shows us each and every time one of those users is created. For my API, I built it using Express and Node. I used a RESTful API instead of GraphQL, which Mongo database will help you set up if you want. But I chose to use RESTful because that's what I'm familiar with. Used Fetch to make those calls, and then Mongo client to make calls to the Mongo database. So let me show you what that looks like in my code. So as you can see in my app, I have a public folder, which we discussed in my first video, and then I have a server folder, which is where my API and my database information is, or my database is API is stored. So let's start with the database, the DAO. I had to take a really long time to create this, and it took me a long time to figure out what my issues were with making the connection between my backend and my database. It turned out that I had to make sure that Heroku had the connection string in it, and also had to make sure that my Mongo database was willing to take IP calls from any IP address, which is very unsafe, but I wasn't sure how else to make it so that my backend would communicate with my database. So for the functions in my DAO, to make the connection, I needed to make sure that I had an async function. The promises weren't working for me, so I had to make sure that I awaited the connection, that I awaited the database, that I waited getting the collection from the database, and then I could finally make changes to the database, which I also had to wait for to get the results. I had to apply this structure to each and every one of my functions to make this work. I have a create an account function, find an account by email function, update your account balance, return all accounts. And lastly, I have a delete an account function. Now, my users have access to the above functions, but they do not have access to delete function. That is something I would assign to the role of a bank teller, which again, I did run out of time, but I will do that in the future. I will create a separate role for bank teller that can delete accounts as well. For my API, I used a RESTful API. I used a post verb to create an account. This passes information through the body to create a new account and creating a new user. I used a post account for searching for users instead of using a poll, because I wanted to make sure that, or instead of using a get, because I wanted to make sure that the information wasn't being passed through the parameters, which is unsecure. So I'm passing it through the body instead. I used put to update the account balance in my database. And then I used get for getting all data. Again, here's my delete account, which my users do not have access to. And that is my database and my API.